Hi everyone. Sorry I disappeared yesterday. As I'm sure you heard from my colleague, slight issue with the power cut, which meant sitting in darkness for a good couple of hours. But anyway, I'm back now, and I've been asked to record the final hour and a bit that we missed. So without too much further delay, let me just share my screen. And let's jump back into the presentation where we were. You will remember this is what we were doing. We're doing an activity, and I had invited you to score your reactions to some scenarios. And obviously, I'm not going to go through the activity by myself, but just wanted to pick up on some of the learning points, I guess, from this activity. This is the scenario we had spent some time discussing, or we were in the process of discussing. And as you may remember from your scores, you all scored things very differently, didn't you? So, what I just want to reinforce from this activity is that, of course, we are all different. And as individuals, inevitably, we're going to look at situations and scenarios very differently. So, that's not a problem. But what is important is if we can recognize that we're likely to see things differently and just be mindful of the fact that, we are all likely to make assumptions. We may all potentially bring with us some bias about how the world should work, how people should behave towards each other, what is an appropriate form of parenting. Um, these are individual values and attitudes that we all have, but also we bring into our work, even if we're not consciously aware of it. So, yeah, I think that's what I just wanted to reinforce. The difference is there's the second scenario we didn't get a chance to look at. The different ways in which we can view a situation, the different values that inevitably we bring into our work. Values are things like the principles and standards that you live your life by. They are not universal for everyone. There are some examples on the slide of where our values and our attitudes come from. Attitudes being things like your beliefs, your opinions. Some of us have got plenty of those. So yeah, just recognizing that some of this may come from childhood, but that obviously depends on how long ago you were a child, because there are clear generational differences in how we see things, where you were raised, and who raised you. Your culture comes into this, of course it does, but I'm not just talking about culture in terms of race and ethnicity. I'm also thinking about things like culture in terms of where you live in the UK and maybe what is normative within your family, or within your community. Think about all the different ideas that we may develop based on things we see through a screen, what we see on the news, how we see people portrayed in television programs and films, whatever we're looking at through social media. None of this is objective reality, but sometimes we consume it and we forget about that. So the I guess the thing that I want to remind you about here is the version of the news depends on the channel you watch, right? So we are all subject to a lot of very different messaging, depending on where we get those sources of information from, who we surround ourselves with. Um, and of course, any one of us could develop sudden or unintended insight into our work. When you become a parent, you potentially have a little bit more empathy for how difficult it might be for other parents to raise their children. If you are involved in care work, you appreciate how difficult it is to care for somebody else in a way that is meaningful, in a way that is person-centered. It's a difficult task. So, yeah, when we recognize the fact that we're all different, and that we bring with us a set of ideas that may differ to the person next to us about how the world works, we can start to think more critically in our work. And we can start to question the impact that maybe our values and our attitudes in our personal lives can also have some influence in our professional assessments. Yeah. So, to combat all of this, what we encourage is some professional curiosity. You may be familiar with this language already. Asking questions, never assume. If we look back at some of these scenarios, let's just get the first one up on the screen. In this scenario, why did Dad respond in this way? What was his instinct? Or what was his intention, excuse me, in smacking his child? Was it to discipline them? Or is he simply embarrassed or ashamed that his child's got caught stealing? What's going on for the child? Do they really understand that stealing is not okay? Or perhaps there's a reason why they haven't quite established that ground rule yet. Why were they stealing the sweets? Were they being opportunistic? Or, worst case scenario, they're hungry. They haven't eaten all day. And, we were just starting to get into that discussion, weren't we, about what the smack may or may not have involved. So, where on the child's body were they smacked? How much force was used? How many times were they smacked? Did they do it in the shop in front of everyone to see? Or did Dad wait until he gets home so then he can hit the child as much as he likes without fear of being judged by other people? This professional curiosity serves us well, right? Because it allows us to gather information. Remember, that's what the focus is here. We're not investigating. We are gathering information so that then we can take our information and our concerns to managers, to safeguarding leads, and think about whether there is harm or the potential for it for this particular child. But don't forget, while you're being professionally curious, it is just as important to remain skeptical. Skeptical about what you may hear or what you may learn while you're gathering information, but also skeptical about what you yourself may be bringing to your assessment of the situation, even if you're not consciously aware of it. So when you're having your conversations within your teams or with your managers or your safeguarding leads and you're raising your concerns, be prepared to question your assumptions, and be prepared to remain objective but also skeptical about what steps you may need to take. Because yes, as I said, these values and attitudes that we bring into our work can be deeply impactful, but it's probably also worth just mentioning that sometimes your mindset, i.e., whether you are a glass half full or a glass half empty person, might also have some impact on your decision making. Because if you are prone to a bit of negativity, then your instinct may be to assume the worst. But also, if you're prone to some optimism, then you're going to assume the best, aren't you? And that might mean that you could miss things. Yeah. So either way, we have to try and mitigate for this possible bias because none of us are immune from that in our work. It doesn't matter what your role is or how experienced you are or how qualified you are. So those are just some of the learning points to take away from that activity that I was dragged away from. What I thought we could turn our attention to now is the overview of the children's framework, because obviously we didn't get into that, did we? So let's take a look at that now. Just to reinforce the legal definition of a child. And for this, we are using Article 1 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Um, this definition reminds us that we are referring to every human being below the age of 18, unless under the law applicable to the child, majority is attained earlier. So that may be obvious to some of you. Everybody under the age of 18 is a child. You obviously legally become an adult in England and Wales when you turn 18. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child is international legislation that forms part of the framework, as we'll go on to see. It's worth recognising that it's not legally binding in the UK, but that UK courts are expected to take the 42 articles of the UNCRC into consideration if they ever need to make decisions on behalf of a child. So obviously, I'm not going to go through all 42 articles now, but it is worth just casting your eye over these if you're not already familiar with them, because so many of them are focused on creating some kind of protection for children. The definition of a child that we're using here also reminds us that where we may need to safeguard those 16 and 17-year-olds, in the eyes of the law, they are still children. They may not see themselves as children, though. They may certainly be involved in situations or relationships that kind of, feel a little bit adult-like, maybe. Um, a local authority might be tempted to try and safeguard this young person as an adult because, they're about to turn 18 or they're involved in adult-like situations or relationships. It's really important that we push back on that and that we advocate strongly in order to make sure that that young person is safeguarded in the way that they're entitled to be under the law. Yeah, so even though they may be 17 years and 6 months of age, they're still entitled to be safeguarded as a child until they turn 18. That being said, and I think I mentioned this document earlier on, it may very well be useful for us to consider transitional safeguarding, and there is a government document on this, so go and check that out on gov.uk. Transitional safeguarding describes the need for an approach to safeguarding these adolescents and young adults fluidly across developmental stages. So one of the best things about transitional safeguarding is it borrows from child protection and adult protection to come up with something even more dynamic. And it aims, as I said, to safeguard that young person from a developmental perspective, which is really important, right? We never safeguard children from a chronological age purely. You could be working with a 17-year-old who, on paper, is at the age of mental capacity. They seem quite switched on, they seem quite savvy, but that doesn't mean to say that they have the maturity to handle their situation. It certainly doesn't mean that they have the necessary ability to make decisions on behalf of themselves or even to recognize the consequences associated with their decisions and actions, right? So yeah, being focused on developmental stages is important because we don't all enter into this phase of adulthood at the same time or at the same pace, do we? We all mature differently. Think back to your adolescence. Maturation may reflect your gender, it may reflect your age, but it can also sometimes reflect what life currently looks like for you. And it's almost certainly going to reflect maybe some of your previous experiences, particularly if those experiences were maybe reflecting some challenge, some adversity for you, particularly children that are exposed to trauma. That can definitely affect their developmental transition into adulthood. So let's have a look at the framework as it applies in England. And the key piece of domestic legislation for us to be aware of is something called the Children's Act 1989. So this is the one that created the framework that we're all using today. And the key principles of safeguarding children are identified here. So I'll just run through these nice and quickly. We've got paramountcy, parental responsibility, prevention, protection, partnership, and participation. So they all start with a P, right? So that's nice. It helps us to remember them. Paramountcy is just emphasizing that the focus should be on the child's best interests. That's what should be held paramount. So we use a child's best interests to determine every decision, every action on their behalf. The principle of parental accountability reminds us that parents, carers, whoever is legally accountable for this child, they have a duty to meet the needs of that child physically, emotionally, socially. And safeguarding is obviously part of that. So, the obvious question to ask if you are ever concerned about a child, first and foremost, is who is responsible for them? And secondly, where are they in the broader context of the concern? Respectfully, why didn't they safeguard the child themselves? Yeah, so that may be something to have some curiosity about. Um, the principles of prevention and protection are no different in the context of safeguarding children to how they are for adults. So we've discussed those earlier. I won't go through them again, as is the principle of partnership. But of course, this time, we are not only aiming to work with professional partners, but we are aiming to work with the family as a whole. Yeah, so they are our other safeguarding partner in that respect. The principle of participation is just reminding us to help that child to have a voice, helping them to participate in the decision-making process. I think I emphasised that point right at the start of yesterday's session, although you may not remember back that far. There are a couple of principles that don't start with a P, which are just as useful to be aware of. We've got the no order principle, which just reinforces the fact that UK courts are only expected to make a legal order around a child when it is absolutely necessary. Yeah. So let's make sure that when we get to that point, we've got all the necessary evidence in place so that we can collectively, I mean, we can all make sure that the right decision is made for that child at the right time. We've got another principle here, which is inviting us to be contextual in our approach. I know that's a word I used a lot on Tuesday. So think child, but also think parent, think family. Yeah, because children don't grow up in isolation, do they? They are directly impacted or maybe even influenced by things that are going on for their friends, for their siblings, for their parents, for their families, for their communities. So when we are contextual in our approach, not only are we better placed to maybe recognize some of the harms or potential harms for a child, but we're also much better placed to respond to them. Because as I also said quite a lot on Tuesday, we've not got a one size fits all solution, right? We want a solution that works for this child and this family at this time. And the final principle is an obvious one, I think, but worth reinforcing. That's the principle of diversity. Obviously, you know, there is so much diversity, not just within your residents that you work with, but also within your staff team. And that's a good thing, right? That we're not all the same. So, as professionals, we have a collective responsibility to celebrate diversity and the fact that we're all different. But at the same time, we can navigate that diversity while still staying focused on keeping children safe. You know, the residents and the families that you work with can be as diverse as they want to be. We can still uphold our responsibility and duty to protect children. Yeah, it's not an either either situation. In addition to the Children's Act 89, then, it's worth recognising we are also subject to the Children's Act 2004. It sounds confusing, doesn't it, that we've got two differently dated legislation with the same name. But that's a situation that we're in. The 2004 version was largely introduced in response to a very particular child protection case. And that is a seminal case involving a little girl called Victoria Colombier. If you're not familiar with the Victoria Colombier case, I would encourage you to go and have a look at that practice review on her. Um, it's a challenging read, I think. It would be remiss of me not to say that. This is a little girl that was essentially tortured by her relatives. And these are practices and behaviours that would kill this little girl. Bearing in mind at the time of her death, she had 128 separate physical injuries on her body. The scale of the harm here was just extraordinary. And that's just the physical harm, right? Emotionally, I don't think any of us can begin to imagine what she endured, how lonely and isolated and frightened she must have felt, being subjected to all these awful rituals and, being told that she's got evil in her and that she needs to be cleansed. But yeah, however difficult a read it is, I think it is an important practice review for us to read so that we can recognise not only Victoria's experiences and give her that legacy, but also understand why this case is as important as it is. Because the government inquiry into this case prompted not only the 2004 version of the Children's Act, but placed new duties on key agencies, such as the duty to cooperate in their efforts to safeguard children, because that was one of the things we learned from this case. Too many different services becoming involved with Victoria and her family, but because they all worked in isolation, they weren't joining up together, they weren't working in partnership. There was this prevailing assumption that somebody else had already done a piece of work. You see how Victoria just falls through the gaps in between. Um, as well as the 2004 version of the Children's Act, this case also prompted the introduction of the Every Child Matters agenda. So again, if you're not familiar with that, it's worth just going and checking that out online as well, so that you can recognise why it's is as important as it is. Uh, Underneath this legislation, we have government guidance papers in the form of the Interagency Guide to Child Protection, which is called Working Together to Safeguard and Keep Children Safe. Again, the clue is in the title there, yeah, in terms of where our focus needs to be. And a range of other guidance documents. I don't want to get too sort of into these today, but it is just worth recognising plenty of guidance documents available to help develop our knowledge either around the types of harm that children might experience. And we've given some examples on the slide of faith-based abuse and fabricated or induced illness, or FII, as it's more commonly known. Um, Other guidance documents still help us to recognise the experiences of particular groups of children. So on this slide, we've given the example of trafficked children. There is a more recent document that's come out to help us think about children in education, particularly children being educated at home. Um, and given, the current climate, I think it's worth also acknowledging there is a useful document to help us understand the experiences of children coming through the refugee and asylum seeker route as well. So, yeah, the good news is you don't have to be an expert on all of these things, but knowing where to go to find additional information or to build your knowledge and help you feel more confident and more competent in recognizing the issues for children is really helpful. When we were discussing the adult framework, we talked about your safeguarding adult boards, didn't we? Or SABs, made up of those three key agencies. In the children's framework, we refer to them as local safeguarding partners. However, it is the same three agencies, right? The police representing criminal justice. We've got the local authority, in this case, representing children's social care. And obviously, we have health representation as well. And they do exactly the same thing as your SABs, but this time, obviously, their focus is on keeping children safe. So they have ultimate accountability for child protection. They develop all that multi-agency policy and guidance, and they undertake practice reviews. So the practice review process is the children's equivalent of the SAR, the Safeguarding Adult Review. We undertake a practice review every time a child dies as a consequence of abuse or neglect, or whenever there is evidence of significant harm. And the purpose of a practice review is very similar to a SAR. Again, it's to try and understand more about what may have happened within this case. Could we do anything to improve our practice? What may we learn from our actions and decisions in this particular situation? Um, so the NSPCC hosts a separate website that has the national database for all practice reviews on it. So yeah, if you're looking for the practice review on Victoria Columbier or any other cases that you've come across, then you don't have to do an internet search for them. You'll be there all day. Go and find that link on the NSPCC website, and then you'll be able to find exactly what you're looking for. There is a separate child death review process, but I'm not going to go into that too much now. Just to emphasise, it is not about rehashing the investigation all over again, but a significant part of it is about making sure that there is support put in place for anybody affected by that child's death, whether it's the parents, the family, the community, or professionals that maybe worked on the case. In exactly the same way as when we looked at the adult framework, your policies and procedures at PJ Care form part of this national framework, right? Because unsurprisingly, the language in those P&Ps really just is reinforcing all of the messaging, all of the language from any of the legislation or any of the guidance documents that I've just referred to. So yeah, it is crucial that you are familiar with and that you understand your policies and procedures so that you are acting as you are expected to, but also so that if necessary, you can help explain why we do things in the way that we do to the people, to the families that you are working with. Yeah, that's really important. So, just to reinforce the categories of harm as they apply to children in England are different to the adult categories, because obviously we talked about 10 categories of abuse for adults. We've only got four for children, and they are physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. So we did spend some time, didn't we, talking about these categories and what to look out for. So I'm not going to go through that again now, but just to reinforce, there is plenty of information about these categories and the signs and indicators of them in your course handout. So as I said earlier, do take the time to go through it when you receive that handout so that you can be really confident about what you need to keep your eyes and ears peeled for. Okay, just want to now reinforce some of the obvious differences in terms of how we work with children or how we work with adults, other than their age. And the most significant difference is that when it comes to safeguarding a child, you don't need to gain their consent, right? Because actually the law says that a child is not capable of making a decision like that. But that being said, it is still good practice to ask, right? Because when we ask, we are helping that child to feel part of the process. There's that principle of participation. And we are helping the child to understand why we're doing things in the way that we are. And we're also helping to give that child a voice. Like I said, we want to be able to support them to participate in this process as much or as little as they want to be able to. So it's important that we help them to recognise that we're still going to safeguard them if we are concerned, even if they would prefer that we didn't. But helping them to be able to have their say, I think is still, can go a long way, can't it? As a general rule, we always strive to inform the parents or carers of that child of our concern, and usually before we take things any further. But I want to stress this nice and carefully. If you have any reason to believe that by informing those parents and carers of your concern, you will place the child or anybody else at further risk, then remember that is not a legal requirement. Okay. And actually, I would reinforce this is never going to be a decision that you make in isolation, right? So we always do this in consultation with managers and safeguarding leads. Um, we take our lead from them because obviously they will have that understanding of the bigger picture around this case and the implications of informing the parents or not, and so on. It's really important that we get these decisions right. We don't want there to be a situation where parents are able to raise a complaint or maybe even a legal challenge, if it gets that far to a court hearing, for example, in the future. Um, and, we want to make sure that we are not only acting appropriately, but also that we're doing so in the best interests of the child and that we are, mindful of the risks that this situation may pose to lots of other people as well. So, always, always seek advice and make sure that if you are expected to, that you document that decision-making process very, very carefully. Remember, the best interests of the child, that principle of paramountcy, comes before everything else. That includes how we adhere to confidentiality policies, how we adhere to general data protection regulations, how we help keep the parents or carers happy. The best interests of the child have to come first. But as I said, your managers and your safeguarding leads will be able to guide you through this process and help you to understand why you're expected to do things in the way that you are. Okay. When it comes to working with adults, obviously things are very, very different because one of the obvious differences between safeguarding adults and children, other than age, is that adults get to self-determine. So what that means is that if your patient or resident is capable of giving consent, i.e., they have the mental capacity to make those kinds of decisions, then we should always seek their consent, even if they've said yes to everything else we've ever asked of them before. Um, if they can make those decisions, then we always check in with them to see if we have their consent. If somebody has capacity and they decide that they don't want us to take any action on their behalf, then that's a decision that we must respect. You may not agree with it. You may strongly disagree with it. But, remember when we were talking about the Mental Capacity Act and we talked about people's right to be wrong, that sometimes we all make unwise decisions in life. This is maybe one of those examples. So, sometimes people will have a change of heart. Sometimes people may, come back to us later on and say, actually, I've had a rethink about this. Can we talk about that again? Um, Usually it's when the person's circumstances have changed or escalated, or maybe when they've just got to know us a little bit better. They're more familiar with our service. They have more confidence in us. But they might never change their mind. Um, if they have the ability to make those decisions, then we must respect their choices. For many of you, given the nature of your work in supporting residents with dementia, you are likely to be working with people who no longer have capacity or perhaps demonstrate fluctuating capacity. So that's where Principles 4 and 5 of the Mental Capacity Act come in, remember. That's where we would then be looking to make a decision in that person's best interests. And obviously, these will be decisions that your managers and your safeguarding leads and that senior staff within your organisation will be focused on. These are not decisions for you to make. Yeah, principle number five, just reinforcing that need to always strive for the least restrictive option. Yeah, we make a decision in someone's best interests, but we always try and limit the impact, if you like, of our decision making. So that's the sort of the best interest route for people who aren't able to make decisions for themselves. Just working with the premise that maybe you're supporting somebody or looking after somebody who does have capacity, who is deemed capacitous, and you're wondering if there's ever any wiggle room, i.e., is there ever an occasion where I actually can act without needing their consent? Well, the short answer is yes. There are two criteria when that may be relevant. The first criteria is if there is a clear public interest. And the obvious example we can offer here is maybe you have determined that the risk that your resident or maybe their family member is experiencing is also putting somebody else at risk. That could be a child or an adult. That may identify a clear public interest to act. Remember, you're the person that you're concerned about may not want you to safeguard them, but they can't stop you from safeguarding somebody else, right? So that's the public interest criteria. The second criteria is if there is a clear duty of care to intervene. And again, the obvious example I want to give you here is if you have heard or seen anything which suggests a serious crime is about to be committed. I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier on when we were talking about FGM. Yeah, that may be grounds to act because, crime creates harm, crime creates victims. We have a responsibility to try and prevent all of that. Again, these are never decisions you make in isolation, right? You will always do so in consultation, and normally it will be a manager or a safeguarding lead that makes this kind of call. But I just think it's useful to know about these criteria, because if ever you find yourself in a situation where you're thinking, is there grounds to overrule? You at least have some idea about what those decisions might be based on. Yeah. Okay, so that's the kind of the basics of gaining consent. Um, I guess what we can sort of take away from all of that is this sort of prevailing responsibility on all of us to be always mindful of and managing risk. Yeah. In the context of safeguarding, we are constantly looking to develop our knowledge around how severe is this risk? How severe a harm is someone being placed under? What is the likelihood of that abuse, that neglect, that harm from happening? Remember, we always use information that either comes directly from the resident or maybe their family member themselves, or we base our assessment on something we ourselves have seen with our own eyes, right? We don't rely on what other people say they've seen or other people say they've heard. That's not concrete enough. So if someone has told you this is what person X does to me, or if you see something with your, as I said, with your own eyes, then that may be solid enough evidence to base your assessment of risk on. That's where that professional curiosity comes in, right? In order for you to gather information, in order to be able to make an effective assessment of risk. But don't forget, we are not just focused on all the things that have already happened, right? We've got to also be future focused. Because respectfully, if something bad has already happened, then what's to stop it from happening again? What's to stop it from being worse next time? These are some of the questions that we may have to consider and be willing to discuss with managers and with safeguarding leads in that ongoing assessment of risk. And don't forget, in the context of safeguarding children, that thorny issue of parental accountability. Why didn't the parents safeguard the child themselves? right? Maybe they tried to do it already and now they need our help and support as professionals to be more effective. Whatever the situation is, that has to be factored into our assessment. As well as focusing on the severity of harm, though, I just want to reinforce this point. And this is a word we use a lot in the context of safeguarding, and that's specificity. So the need for clarity and detailed information, right? Think back to those scenarios that I asked you to score just before I disappeared. They were quite vague, weren't they? They were quite open to interpretation. There were so many gaps to fill in. And of course, the problem is we all do that in a slightly different way. So, in order to avoid that, what we strive for is information that is verifiable. We strive for language that is as specific as possible. So, I'll give you an example of something that's not specific. This happens to me often. I mean, what is this? And what does often mean? Right? It's just, there are so many questions, aren't there, from a statement like that. So always strive for specificity because the more specific we are, the more likely we are to make a more effective assessment of the risk and then manage it effectively, obviously. I have hopefully, as we've been going through this course, reminded you about why it's so important to be really familiar with your safeguarding policies and procedures at PJ Care. But what I want to turn our attention to now is an issue which means we also need just as much familiarity and confidence in another set of policies and procedures. So what we are talking about now is abuse that is perpetrated by people in positions of trust, or what we call pipot abuse. Now, we're all pipots, aren't we? Right? We all are in this relationship of trust. We all have a very privileged position where we have access to very sensitive information and where your residents and their family members place their trust in you to look after the people that are important to them. So when we uh, develop a suspicion that maybe somebody in a position of trust is violating that trust and taking advantage of maybe the power and the responsibility that comes with their role, it's really important that we act sooner rather than later. So remember, everyone in a position of trust. And that's staff members, no matter how many hours they work every week. It could be a volunteer, it could be somebody who only does bank sessions. We're all pipots, no matter how often we work. We all have a duty of care to uphold the standards and the ethics of our work. So as I said, when people violate that, we need to think very carefully about who we would take our concerns to. On the slide, we talk about following organisational PIPOT policies. Now, I just want to say, I would be very surprised if they are called that at PJ Care. They aren't always. Usually they're called disclosure policies or whistleblowing procedures. Okay. So, whatever they are called at PJ Care, make sure you're really familiar with that process because hopefully you will never need to follow it. But as I think I said before, forewarned is forearmed, right? We don't want there to be a situation where you develop a concern about another pipot and then you're running around, in a mad panic trying to figure out, what you should be doing to deal with that situation. We want you to be confident, we want you to be knowledgeable, and we want you to use those policies and procedures sooner rather than later. So whether that's in response to a suspicion that you have begun to develop about another pipot, and that might be because you have seen how they have behaved towards a child or an adult. Whether or not that behavior caused harm, it could just be behavior that made you think, oh, I'm not sure that was appropriate. Or I know that that is absolutely not how we're expected to do things here, right? Any behavior like that is something that needs to be reported to a manager sooner rather than later. And obviously, if you see or hear anything which suggests an offence has been committed against or related to a child or adult, well, that needs to be reported as well, doesn't it? Sooner rather than later. So it could be a suspicion that you develop. It could be an allegation. A resident might say to you, mm, such and such did this to me yesterday, and I just didn't like it. It didn't make me feel very comfortable at all. Or maybe one of their family members or a visitor comes in and says, well, the person that we saw last week, they didn't do it like this. And you think, oh, yeah, well, that's absolutely not okay. It shouldn't have been done like that. These are the sorts of things that need to be reported. Yeah. All allegations, all suspicions of a person in a position of trust need to be taken seriously. Yeah, you know that. So it doesn't matter who your concern is about. It could be a very senior person at PJ Care. It could be your colleague that you like, that you trust, that you didn't think was capable of this stuff. And it also doesn't matter who's bringing the concern. It could be a resident with fluctuating capacity. It could be, their family member that has an active imagination. Do you know what I mean? Either way, every concern, every suspicion needs to be taken further. There needs to be a process, and you all understand why. Because people in positions of trust that abuse those positions, they hide in plain sight, right? And sometimes they act on this assumption that there will be this culture of silence, that no one's going to report them, no one's going to call them out. Well, we're going to prove them wrong, right? So, as I said, make sure you are familiar with those policies and procedures and that you call out anything that you know is not right. Because I'm just going to make the obvious point here. If we don't say something, who's going to, right? Because your residents may not be able to. Their family members may not feel like they can because they rely on you and your team to look after their relatives, right? So we need to be the ones that take a stand and make sure that we are, keeping people safe, right? That's why we do what we do. These are just some case examples of pipot abuse. I mean, some of these are genuinely shocking. So I'll just run through these nice and quickly with you just to give you some idea about what people are capable of. This is somebody called Zolia Alemi. She came to the UK back in 1995 from New Zealand originally. She claimed that she had trained and qualified as a doctor, so she registered to be a doctor in the UK in 1995. Believe it or not, it wasn't until 2018 when she was accused of financial harm, i.e., fraud, by a patient, and actually she was guilty of that, that it then turns out she wasn't qualified as a doctor at all. In fact, she hadn't even finished the first year of her medical degree. So, yeah, talk about hiding in plain sight. She'd been pretending to be a doctor all of that time, and she'd never even finished her bachelor's degree. This is somebody called Benjamin Poole. In 2021, he was found guilty of causing sexual assault to somebody that he was meant to be looking after in a mental health facility. This was a young woman who had very serious epileptic seizures, and she reported feeling different after she had had a seizure, particularly when Benjamin was on shift. And a relative had given her one of those fancy new alarm clocks that had actually got a built-in camera. And the camera footage showed Benjamin sexually assaulting this patient whilst she was having a seizure or very soon afterwards. I mean, can you imagine? It's shocking stuff, I know, to conceive that people are capable of doing these kinds of things, but that's the world that we live in, unfortunately. So the obvious question to reinforce here is, what signs and indicators might you notice in others that are causing the harm? Because, if we only talk about the signs and indicators in victims, which we do have a lot of in safeguarding training, then potentially we are missing 50% of the information. So do take a moment to reflect on what kinds of behaviours or what sort of things that you might see in the course of your work that would get your attention, that would make you question someone's motivations, or just, why on earth are you doing it like that? Because that's not how we do it here. Yeah. That's not what the policy said. That's not what we've been trained to do. So as I said, be on the lookout for this stuff. Because I am not suggesting that anyone is capable of this in PJ care. But the point is, when we take our eye off the ball, that's when the potential for this stuff increases. Yeah. So please stay vigilant. In thinking about the fact that, people in positions of trust are capable of causing abuse or neglect, we need to recognise that the Care Quality Commission would, in this sense, they would recognise what they call a closed culture. I know we talked about this a little bit in the context of organisational abuse when I was still with you in the Zoom. But just wanted to kind of reinforce this language. A closed culture is a poor one within a health and care service that increases the risk of harm. Remember, this might include abuse, but also human rights breaches. So, a closed culture within a service means that people are not able to speak up for themselves. That might be because of a lack of communication skills, but it might also be because of a lack of support to speak up or abuse of their rights to speak up. People that are deliberately silenced, or they're threatened, or they're made to feel like, well, you can say something, but no one's going to take you seriously. Yeah. Obviously, certain services and groups of people will be at greater risk. These include services that provide care for people with learning disabilities and people who are autistic, but also older adults, people with dementia, people who may not have regular contact with families, or who have, reduced capacity, challenges with their memory, maybe not quite as effective at advocating for themselves. Remember, the development of a closed culture, it can be deliberate, but it can also be unintentional. Either way, this is a culture that causes unacceptable harm to a person and the people that are important to them, right? So we must collectively do everything we can to try and avoid the development of a closed culture within our services. And it is also imperative that as individuals, we recognise our responsibility to protect children and vulnerable adults from misunderstanding the nature of the relationships that we have with them. Right? That's why we keep talking and training you in things like professional boundaries, because you know, part of your work is about developing relationships, isn't it? You need to be able to have a good working relationship with somebody that you're looking after. But remember, those relationships must always be professional and they must always be respectful, never personal. You can be personable, right? You can be friendly, you can be approachable, but you always have to stay professional as well. So make sure you know where that line is. And if you're ever feeling like your boundaries are being breached, and that could be by a colleague, a resident, somebody that's visiting them, then that's something to take to a manager. That's something to discuss very, very carefully. Because as well as you respecting other people's boundaries, it's important that they respect yours as well. Yeah. So, safeguarding supervision might be somewhere where you take these professional boundary concerns, or it could be somewhere where you take your concerns about a particular safeguarding case that you are working on. I don't know if safeguarding supervision is something that you would need to request at PJ Care, or whether it's something that is available upon request. But it is just important that we recognise that if we're involved in a case where there's a lot of safeguarding work, sometimes it could be helpful to have access to conversations where we can seek some ideas about that work. We can get some maybe advice or signposting about how to manage the case. And also that we have somewhere where we can talk about how maybe this case or whatever might have happened to the person you're trying to safeguard, how it has left us feeling. Because, we can have all kinds of thoughts and feelings in response to our work. And it's really important that we've got somewhere to take that stuff. Because you don't want to take it home, do you? And you also don't want to try and, suppress it and pretend like it's not happening. Because no matter how well you do that, trust me, this stuff has a nasty habit of coming out when you least expect it. And that's not good for your residents. That's not good for your colleagues. And it's definitely not fair on your family and friends, right? So, whether safeguarding supervision is a formal process at PJ Care, or whether it's just an informal check-in that you do with each other, or maybe you do a sort of critical debrief after a situation has happened, just making sure that you know you've got somewhere where you can take any of your, as I said, your responses, your thoughts, your feelings, your reactions to your safeguarding work, so that we can process all of that stuff. Because of course, this is going to make you more sustainable in your role, isn't it? This is about how your organisation looks after you. This is about how your organisation safeguards you as well. Yeah. So, whether or not there is a formal safeguarding supervision policy at PJ Care, or whether it's just, you grabbing a colleague and saying, can we have a quick cup of tea and a chat about that? Because I just need to, vent, or, just let somebody else hear me go "Roar" for 5 minutes, whatever it looks like. Um, Make sure that you are thinking about what support you might need. Because sometimes some of the stuff that we are exposed to in our safeguarding practice, it can be challenging, right? For all kinds of reasons, right? So it's a bit like I said at the start of the course. Just keep an eye on how you're feeling, check in with yourself. You notice any reactions, let me know. This is a more long-term version of that. Okay, so obviously we spent a lot of time talking about what to recognise. What I want to turn our attention to now is our responses, but specifically how we respond to a disclosure of abuse, because I've obviously just spent a lot of time talking about the importance of being professionally curious. But when it comes to handling a disclosure, this is where we do things slightly differently. So let me just reinforce some good practice when it comes to how to respond to a disclosure. Try and stay calm. I know it's difficult. You might be panicking inside, but just try and stay calm and listen. That's the most powerful thing you can do. Stop what you're doing, listen carefully, and give this person your full attention. Help them to know that you are taking them seriously. You can reassure them as well if you want to. You can say, it's okay, I'm here, you've got my attention, just in your own time, tell me what you need to tell me. But what is very important is that you just let that person do all the talking, right? And I'll explain why in just a second. When they stop talking, that is your cue to explain what you might need to do next and why, right? So seeking consent if you need to, or that might be explaining to a family member that this is something you may need to go and tell a manager about, if that family member was in the room, obviously. So make sure that you just keep this explanation as simple as possible. Don't overload people. Don't make it too complicated. Be capacity appropriate. But let's stay focused on the level of emergency, right? Because if someone's life's at risk, or if there's a risk of imminent injury, then respectfully, I'm going to deal with that first, and then I'll explain the policy to you afterwards. Yeah. So, as I said, just make sure you keep that nice and simple, but do cover all of the salient points. That's what to do. What not to do is just as simple. No strong reactions. No matter how disgusted or offended or upset you are, you've got to try and find a way to contain all of that, right? So, no making comments, no jumping to conclusions about what you've heard, speculating about whether anybody else already knew about this or accusing anybody. You've got to keep all of that to yourself, right? No making promises, either to keep it a secret or to make sure that justice gets done or that, the right thing will happen because you've told me. You can't do that sort of thing, right? And no interrupting people with lots of questions. So this is a subtle difference, right? Because when we're handling a disclosure, we cannot continue to be professionally curious. Because when you keep interrupting people, asking them questions, well, there's two reasons why. First of all, you could be accused of leading their narrative, of influencing what they remember. Particularly if you ask a question in a certain way, someone might say, "Oh, you put words in my mouth," or "You made me think that that was the important bit to focus on." Yeah, so we don't want there to be any suggestions of that. But secondly, you might just overwhelm that person because if you're asking them questions that they can't answer for whatever reason, then you are making what is already very difficult infinitely harder than it needs to be, right? So, we're not the police. We're not here to investigate. We don't need to ask questions. We simply need to pay as much attention as possible to what they're telling us. We receive that information and we don't keep interrupting people. No unnecessary disclosures. What I mean by this is not everyone on shift is going to need to know what you've just been told, right? So it is your responsibility to contain this disclosure and make sure that the next person that hears about it is either a manager or a safeguarding lead. Yeah. The reason we want to contain this narrative is because, if somebody else finds out what's just been reported and that person is involved in causing the harm, then maybe they go and destroy some of the evidence that backs up this disclosure. Yeah, so we have to protect it very carefully. And also, no messing about. This is now your priority and it should be handled as such, right? So everything else can wait. When you receive a disclosure, this now jumps to the top of the list. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to speak to a manager or a safeguarding lead. Yeah, are we all clear on that? So that's the kind of basics really of how to handle a disclosure. I know the thought or idea of receiving a disclosure can be scary. But imagine if you can imagine being scared by being on the receiving end, imagine what it's like for the person giving the disclosure. They might have never told anyone this stuff before. And it might be there's something about you that just makes them feel safe, or it just makes them feel like, this person's going to really listen to me. So maybe I'm going to take a chance and I'm going to say this stuff out loud for the first time. So it is important that we get this stuff right. But it is also important that we don't worry too much about it. And because actually, how to get it right is quite simple. Yeah. So focus on your listening, pay attention, because of course you're going to have to document some of this very carefully, and make sure that you go and find a manager and safeguarding lead as quickly as you can. When it comes to recording, Bear in mind, all of the care centres record any safeguarding incidents on your electronic system, which is that single repository for safeguarding reporting. This is very high tech. The system enables quality assurance and governance to be maintained throughout the company. Each site reports the themes, the trends, the lessons learned monthly through local governance meetings, which are then shared across all centres through corporate governance and ultimately with the board monthly at their meetings for information assurance and governance. So we've got, checks and levels at every single stage and every single level of the organisation. So this is a system that enables and assures all relevant information, all communication, all evidence, and all reporting requirements are stored in one single system, which makes things nice and easy when it comes to the point of audit and inspection, and all of which complies with confidentiality and the general data protection regulations. So trust me, it doesn't look like this everywhere. This is really this is the gold standard, right? This is how it should be. So it's just helping you understand why this system has been put in place and how it benefits you in your work. In terms of why we need to keep records and why good documentation is important, well, it's the law. Let's just start there. It is a legal requirement that we document everything. And it is a recurring theme in the context of safeguarding reviews as well, where poor record keeping is identified as a significant challenge. So it may be that conversations that happened with the family or with the resident are conspicuously absent in the records, or maybe someone's decision-making process isn't quite clear enough. When a safeguarding concern is escalated, of course, each service should have clear and accurate records to share. And it's important that all those records are stored in accordance with the organisation's policies and procedures and with regard to the GDPR, Data Protection Act of 2018. That's GDPR, isn't it? Good principles or principles, I should say, of good record keeping. Obviously, we need some continuity and consistency throughout the entire service. That helps us to manage risk more effectively. As I said, it helps us to demonstrate how we make our decisions, particularly in relation to things like mental capacity, best interest decisions. It provides evidence of that partnership work, whether it's with the child, whether it's with the family, whether it's with the resident, whether it's with the social worker, whoever it might be. And it also means that we've got the most up-to-date information available to us in order to support ongoing decision making. Remember, where you might need to modify your communication approach, then it's really important that we capture that in the documentation so that everyone that communicates with that person, that resident, that family member going forward uses the right approach, right? That's really important. That comes back to that continuity and consistency, but it also just means that it helps people to feel heard. Yeah, it helps people to know that their communication is being taken seriously. And I appreciate you will probably have, the electronic system available to you that allows you to document your safeguarding concerns. But think of the information on this slide as a bit of a reminder, if you like, a cheat sheet for the level of detail that needs to be included in your records. So remember, the emphasis is on facts, dates, times. Um, whether it's the date and time of the incident or the date and time that you became aware of it, i.e., the disclosure, the date and time that you sat down to actually make the formal report. Who does it concern? We want the person's names, we want their contact details. We maybe need to know if anybody else has been affected by this and their details as well. We want to capture the information from witnesses. So this is all information that can be verified, right? Everything else that we include is either something we have seen, and we call those observations, or it's something that somebody has said. Remember, no matter how compelling their version of events was, it doesn't make it fact at this point, right? Because people say all kinds of things. And no matter how convincing they are, it doesn't mean it's true. So we can include all of this information in our records, but we need to make sure we're very clear about the difference between what is fact, what is observation, what is allegation, and what is action, i.e., what are you going to do about it, right? So you may have already taken some actions, but you may also have an action plan of things that you now need to do, right? So make sure you are capturing all of that nice and carefully as well. Who have you involved in the process? Are you going to advise the parents and carers if we're talking about a child? Do you need to speak to someone's social worker or the police or whoever it might be? And if you have discussed it with a manager and safeguarding lead and they've concluded it isn't a safeguarding issue to take to the local authority, then why not? What are we going to do instead? Right? Because you can't raise a concern and then there be no action afterwards. So make sure you kind of close the loop, if you like, and we've got clear evidence of why we didn't do anything else. I mean, it could be there's not enough information at this stage to take things further. So let's all agree to continue to monitor this issue and then revisit it and then date time, whatever it might be, right? So we can measure against that. Um, Officially, you are well within your rights to offer your professional opinion. Note I say professional opinion if you think it's relevant, but I'm just going to remind you, the moment that you commit your professional opinion to document is the moment that you can be challenged on it in a court of law, ultimately, right? So my strongest possible advice is that unless you are 110% confident on your professional opinion and you've got the evidence to back it up, maybe you want to keep your opinions to yourself. Yeah. Because, yeah, nobody wants to find themselves in that kind of situation where, their opinion is being torn to shreds and then their reputation and the reputation of their organization is in tatters as well. Yeah. There are the details of Dr. Alan Perry. I am reliably informed that as the Director of Clinical Services, he is the company's safeguarding lead. I hope that is still the case. But yeah, get to know the safeguarding leads within the unit that you work in. Obviously, all the safeguarding leads at PJK would be my advice. So that if you need them at any point, you've either got their emails or their telephone numbers. And of course, that information should be on your safeguarding boards. There should be boards within the unit with all of those contact details on, and no doubt it'll be identified in your policies and procedures as well. So this is where I want to kind of wrap things up, just reinforcing some golden rules around information sharing. And these are according to the Caldecott principles. Don't worry too much about that. It's ancient NHS case history that we're not going to get into now. But yeah, just run through these nice and quickly. Number one, remember, adhering to data protection is not a barrier to sharing information. It maybe just means we have to think about how we share that information and when we share it and so on. Always be open and honest about your information sharing, unless by doing so, you can see there is a risk to you or to somebody else. And if that's the case, I would always encourage you to seek advice from a manager or a safeguarding lead, right? If in doubt, check it out beforehand. Always share with consent wherever appropriate, and always consider the safety and well-being of everybody involved in the information sharing process, and that includes you. Yeah. Every time we do share information, remember, it needs to be considered necessary, proportionate, that's proportionate to the risk, remember, relevant, accurate, timely, and also secure. Every time you do share information, even if it's a corridor conversation with a colleague, there needs to be a record of it, right? Otherwise, remember, that conversation never happened. So, as I said, those rules aren't particularly complicated. But that's just some good practice in relation to information sharing in your role. These are the themes I have tried to covered in I tried to cover, I should say, in this course. Apologies once again for the interruption. I hope this recording has been received well and it's helped to reinforce the points that I have made throughout the day. That hierarchy of commitment diagram in the bottom right hand corner is just reinforcing that message. I hope that came through loud and clear already. Remember, if you're concerned, you should be taking action, right? Even if everyone else around you doesn't seem that worried, even if you can anticipate somebody else may have already acted on their concern, remember, if you're worried, you should also take things further as well. That's that safeguarding personal duty that we all have. This guy can have the last word. It's quite a poignant quote, isn't it? So, thanks for your time, everyone. Appreciate your flexibility in taking the time to watch this recording as well. Emails will be coming out to you very soon from Gateway, recognizing that you've successfully completed the course. So be on the lookout for that. There is a course evaluation process. So when you open the one of the emails, you'll notice there's not too much in the body of the email. You're going to see a link like that one there, and all you have to do is click it, right? That link is going to take you to a separate web page, which is going to ask you a couple of questions about what your experience of this course has been. You know the drill by now. Please just be honest and constructive. Yeah, but your feedback will be well received. And in the next email, you're going to see another link which will give you access to a PDF that's got your certificate in and also your course handout. Yeah. So, yeah, that's all I wanted to get through in this recording. As I said, once again, I hope that has found you well and sorry for disappearing. But hope to be able to see you on another safeguarding course or perhaps another course sometime soon. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Be well. Bye bye.